Hi, everyone. I'm Guido Di Pasquale, Managing Director of PAVE Europe, and welcome to the 7th PAVE Europe virtual panel. This event is organized in collaboration with the Coalition for Imagined Mobility, and I'm thrilled to have here with us Kim Watts from Remo. Kim will support this panel discussion and will give the closing remarks. So welcome, Kim.
Thanks, Guido.
So today we are having a conversation surrounding the regulatory frameworks in the European Union and the United Kingdom. Our focus will be on the challenges and opportunities these frameworks present as enablers and accelerators for the development and deployment of the so-called CCAM, Connected, Cooperative and Automated Mobility. And as you know, the goal of CCAM is to enhance road safety, alleviate traffic congestion, and foster sustainable and accessible transportation systems. But yet achieving these ambitions necessitates navigating multifaceted regulatory challenges and seizing the opportunities they present. So today we are really privileged to have an illustrious panel of experts who will illuminate various aspects of CCAM deployment in Europe. Our panelists represent a diverse array of expertise and perspectives. Their insights and experiences will enrich our discussion, encompassing regulatory, technological, and economic dimensions of CCAM in Europe. So I'm very delighted to introduce our distinguished panelists, Jessica Guccioni, Head of CAM Adoption Strategy at the Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles, which is part of the UK Department for Transport. Hello, Jessica, welcome. Cristina Galassi, Team Leader for Automated Connected Vehicles and Safety at DG GROW, European Commission. Hello, Cristina. George Ivanov, Head of International Policy and Government Affairs at Waymo. Hello, George. And last but not least, Céline Zhu, Products and Partnership Manager at Swiss Re. Hello, Céline. So welcome, everyone. I have to say that we had many registrations for this event, and we also have had numerous questions suggested to our panelists. I will make every effort to include as many of these questions as possible in my inquiries. But you will also have the opportunity to send your questions afterwards. So we will try also to answer the questions offline if we will not have the time today to answer all these questions. So let's start. I would like to start asking to introduce yourself and your link to the AV space, starting with Cristina, maybe. Could you tell us a bit more about your role at DG GROW, the European Commission?
Of course. Thank you, Guido, and good afternoon to everyone, or good morning, or good evening, depending on from which part of the world you are following us. So indeed, my name is Maria Cristina Galassi. As you mentioned, I'm leading the team dedicated on automated vehicles, so connected automated vehicles and safety in DG GROW. And DG GROW is the department of the European Commission, which is in charge of ensuring industrial growth in the European Union. So we are responsible for the Commission policies on single market, industry, entrepreneurship, and small businesses, so small, medium enterprises. And my focus, again, is on driving automation and specifically on aspects related to connectivity and safety.
Thank you, Cristina. And Jessica, hello. Could you tell us something more about the CCAM and your role?
Absolutely. It's a delight. It's a real delight to be here. So my name is Jessica Guccioni. I'm one of the deputy directors at the Centre for Connected and Autonomous Vehicles. And as Guido said, it's a joint unit. So I'm predominantly working on the Department for Transport side, but it also has the Department for Business. So it's a joint unit of the two, established in 2015. I've only been with CCAF for about 6 months, and in this period, my main focus has been on helping the preparedness for a regulatory framework around self-driving, as well as looking at trials without a safety driver. So those have been the main things that I've been thinking about since joining. But my connection with the department goes back to 2018, when I was still working for the Law Commission. So I've been working with them, and I know all the people in it for a while. And of course, many of you here, I met through my work at the Law Commission, doing the regulatory review, coming up with some recommendations for legislation. So that's also, I guess, my connection to the field, more on the legal side too. And yeah, I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Jessica. And George, welcome.
Thank you,
Please,
Guido.
could you introduce yourself and what you do at Waymo?
Sure. And good afternoon, everybody, and good morning. My name is George Avnav. I lead the International Policy and Government Affairs work at Waymo. I've been working in this space for about 11 and a half years now, which started working with US legislators and regulators and policymakers as they were figuring out the early days of autonomy all the way to the present day, where these are really global debates, global discussions on bringing true safety and mobility benefits to people. But really the first step is engagement with governments. And so that's why I'm here today and happy to be part of this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Welcome, George. And Xilin, welcome.
Hello.
Could you tell us a bit more about Swiss Re and what you do, and why Swiss Re is interested in the AV space?
Yeah. So well, first, it's great to see everyone. Great to meet everyone. My name is Shalene. I work at Swiss Re, and just to give a brief intro of what Swiss Re is, it's a global reinsurance company. So more generally, we help insurers manage their own risks, which means like we insure the insurance companies. We also create products or risk assessment models for insurers. Why Swiss Re is interested in AVs? AVs is a very new and it's a challenging space for insurers for sure. It's an interesting technical and a decision-making problem, given that you have like a novel and rapidly evolving risk with also like a challenging and also evolving regulatory environment. How do we make pricing and underwriting decisions about this? So that's the context in which I work. I work at products and partnerships at Swiss Re, specifically in AV risks, and together with my team, we help to reduce uncertainty around AV risks for the purpose of accurate risk assessment. So I'm very excited and very grateful to have the chance to be here today and hear from all of you.
Thank you very much for joining us. So let's start with introducing, let's say, the topic. Christina, if you allow me, and talking about the European Commission and the role the European Commission is playing in shaping the regulatory framework for CCAM across the European Union. So there was a regulation that was published from more than 1 year ago, so July 22. It's probably the first of its kind. And so could you tell us about this regulation, why and how your work and the work of your predecessors led to this result? And also there is a promise that there will be new measures in the coming year, 24 up to 29. So where we are, and is this happening?
Thank you for your question, and it is quite broad. And let me start saying that indeed the Commission set its strategy towards connectivity and automation since quite some time ago. So this happened through the release of several communication and strategies since 2016. So we had several communications in a row, and the last one is from 2020, the Sustainable and Smart Mobility Strategy. But most importantly, what you mentioned, since 2019, we adopted the new EU General Safety Regulation, which is a really broad scope regulation, and it aims at improving the safety of both vehicles and on road. because indeed there was this need highlighted and stressed before 2019, so 2018 to 2017, to really improve the safety on our roads due to the high rate of accidents in Europe. So these general safety regulations indeed set new rules, new requirements for conventional vehicles. It mandates the use of assistance systems for all vehicle categories, starting from passenger cars, but also vans, buses, coaches, and trucks. So, and this is really aiming to improve safety at all levels. And most importantly, from my perspective, of course, it also sets the legal basis to develop the implementing measures, technical rules for automated driving. And that's where we have been working in the last years. And one of the results is the regulation that you mentioned that was adopted last summer, Regulation 1426, that addresses the type approval of fully driverless vehicles. And this goes hands in hands with the plan for the Commission to regulate automated driving vehicles, because we also work not only at European level, but also at United Nations level, where in 2021, there was the adoption of the so-called ALKS regulation. So a new regulation, the first regulation for automated driving, regulating the approval of vehicles equipped with automated lane keeping systems, and now also lane change systems operating on highway. So with these two regulations, actually, we can type approve already since a couple of years in Europe, both automated vehicles with still the driver on board, like the automated lane keeping systems, and fully driverless vehicles like shuttles, robotaxis, automated valet parking, and hub-to-hub commercial applications. So the work on European level was more focused on this second regulation. So for the so-called level 4 fully driverless vehicles. And indeed, this new regulation is still linked to the work performed at United Nations level, because it is the first practical implementation of the high-level concepts developed under GRVA, so under the Working Party for Automated and Autonomous Vehicles. So we make use of these theoretical concepts and methodologies to write our regulation. And in this sense, we have an innovative approach, because compared to the past, where conventional vehicles are mainly verified through testing for what concerns vehicle safety aspects, in this regulation we have several steps. So the first step is an analytical phase. So the authority will analyze indeed the documentation, results of testing provided by the manufacturer. Then there will be a physical testing phase where the vehicles will be tested on tracks, so in confined environments, controlled environments, and then on public roads once they're safe enough, of course. And then there will be a third phase, which will take place after the market introduction. And this is the real indeed innovation compared to the past. With the past, type approval ended with the certification release type approval authority, and that's it. So nothing more than, or almost nothing. So now we are still also introducing something more than what is available with market surveillance, for example, or PTI. So we do not limit ourselves to specific inspection, but the safety of these vehicles will have to be ensured throughout the lifetime of the vehicle and will be monitored throughout the lifetime of the vehicle by the manufacturer with some mandatory reporting to the authority. So these are the innovative aspects that we introduced compared to the past. And I think as a general idea, this can be enough from my side, but of course I would be happy to answer more specifically to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cristina. There was a question from the audience asking what was the biggest regulatory challenge for automated driving at the EU level. So if you can share, that was something challenging for you and your team.
Yes, I think where we started from were two basic questions, very simple, but very challenging. So how safe is safe enough, and how we can demonstrate that? So the main challenge was really starting from those two questions and build the regulation.
Okay, and it is at the core of what you do and is leading your work, I guess. Thank you very much, Jessica. So jumping to the UK reality, the UK has a unique perspective on CCAM regulation post-Brexit, and having developed its own regulatory framework while maintaining also close ties with the EU standards and initiative. So could you give us an overview of the current policies, what you are doing at CCAV, what you are doing in UK, and what's the approach, and also maybe the differences or the similarities with the EU approach?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Guido. So we started in terms of regulation for self-driving. The UK really kicked off with what Shalene was telling us about. The insurance angle actually was the very first regulatory aspect we tackled. So that was in 2018. So we passed a law that was really directed to ensuring that anyone that might be harmed by an automated vehicle could have an easy route to redress. And that was a particular challenge for us because the approach to insurance is on the driver as opposed to the vehicle in the UK. So that, I think, was one of the first things that we had to address in terms of thinking about self-driving. And the whole approach the UK has taken has been a very light touch regulatory approach thus far. So we've got a code of practice that was established in 2015 and has been updated regularly, which basically means that there's no requirement for a permit as such in order to do testing on our public roads, but you have guidance in respect of how you can comply with existing laws. So that's just the overall feel for it. But the work that the law commissions published, and they did the final report in 22, that was then also accepted by UK government, would put in place a regulatory framework that is actually very aligned with what Christina was talking about, you know, the whole safety concept approach of analyzing the safety of a self-driving vehicle. So very much, like Christina said, looking at the safety case and the documentation, the organizational structures that are in place, and how you know, the professional competence of these companies are in maintaining safety, all the way through to physical testing, because of course type approval still plays a part. We would envisage in respect of just the technical requirements developed domestically, and of course once we have UN regulations for this, they would also be imported into the expectations of an ADS. And of course we have ALKS, for example, which we do also apply in the UK. And then the in-use monitoring that Christina also highlighted is something, looking at the ongoing safety of the vehicle is very much an important part of how we're seeing the regulation of self-driving going forward. I think, of course, the European Commission has to take a very different approach, being a supranational entity compared to the UK and thinking about our regulation. But something I find quite interesting, and that I think is a bit different in the UK compared to other jurisdictions that we've looked at, is the integration of a single regulatory framework for self-driving, which covers both vehicles that issue transition demands and have a human driver that might drive for part of a journey, alongside the regulation of, you know, the so-called, you know, shuttles and level 4 that have no human interaction. So we've brought them under a single regulatory framework, you know, with a common assessment of that safety threshold that, again, Christina was highlighting how safe is safe enough, is a common question that we address across the piece. And then having different regulatory approaches, but within this singular overarching framework for what we call user in charge vehicles, where you might have a human that still there's the driving seat, they might drive some of the time, and there's special regulation of transition demands and the ALKS type model, versus something that's more like what the ADS regulation is covering. So looking at shuttles and things where you never expect a human to drive, they could indeed travel around empty. So having that more integrated overarching aspect is something I think a bit different than what I've seen in other areas.
Thank you very much, Jessica, for this perspective from UK. And now going to the industry side, George, as a leading autonomous driving technology company, Waymo, you can bring a unique perspective to this panel, of course, bringing also the extensive experience that Waymo has gained in the past years in US. So how do you see Europe first, from your perspective, with this diverse regulatory landscape compared to US, and also the fact that we have different countries that have to implement the EU directives, and we have UK. So how does Waymo navigate and adapt, or would adapt to these regulatory challenges, and what would be the strategies from your side, if you can share?
Sure. That's a great question, Guido. So just a little bit of background regarding Waymo's operations in the United States. So in October of 2020, we became the first company globally to launch a commercial for a hire fully autonomous service without a driver. That was in the United States, in the city of Phoenix, Arizona. And we followed that on quite recently in the last year with operations in San Francisco, and have now secured the final permits for that commercial operation as well. Our next markets will be Los Angeles and then Austin, Texas. So when you're looking just at those cities, you're talking about 3 separate state regulatory and legislative regimes in the United States that all really live within the broader regulatory structures we have for automobiles and for traffic laws and regulations. And sitting on top of that is the federal government's authority over motor vehicle safety and ensuring the absence of unreasonable risk for any motor vehicle equipment or motor vehicles. So navigating multiple jurisdictions has always been a part of the process for Waymo from the very beginning, when we initially began in 2009 as the Google Self-Driving Car Project. More than 40 US states now have AV regulatory regimes, and it's taken about a decade for that to happen. But it really means that for a company like Waymo to successfully navigate that process, there has to be some harmonization and early expectations for what you can and can't commercially do. And that's critical to why we've been engaging with the European Commission, with the United Kingdom, and with the member states in the EU that have been working and really looking ahead to all of the use cases described, whether it's ride-hailing, personal car ownership, trucking. Having a commercial expectation of what the outcome can be for governments is really where we begin to actually do the advanced planning necessary. I saw a question in the chat regarding where will Waymo be operating in Europe, and it's a great question. But ultimately, it partly depends on the regulatory and legislative regimes. In the United States currently, we have full ability to commercially operate in California, in Arizona, in Texas. Those legislative frameworks were set years ago in many cases. And I think what we're seeing in Europe now is the beginning of the process for setting final regulatory procedures. I think the UK, as Jessica mentioned, has been on a path for many, many years of looking at the legislation and traffic laws and road rules. And we're hopeful that work on primary legislation will unlock fully commercial operation there. As Christina mentioned, the EU's had the first multinational vehicle safety regulation, and we think that's a very, very important piece and global signal for harmonization. Unfortunately, that regulation only allows for up to 1,500 vehicles per year to be deployed by a single manufacturer, and it does also rely on European member states passing domestic legislation. So that's a tall order, and I think when you look at the question of when will all of the European member states pass their own laws, we could be many, many years, I think, in the future and still asking the same questions about when will that align with the newly harmonized EU approach. And so in many respects, the timelines depend on the countries, they depend on the use cases, they just depend on the flexibility allowed by those that are enabled. And we look forward to working with governments as those open up one by one by one. I think it's no accident to say, though, the countries that are most ready will be the readiest for the companies that are the most mature in this space, whether from a safety or mobility or a use case perspective. And so while we don't have any announcements to make today, ultimately, we see it as extremely important to work on this joint harmonization between US approaches, EU approaches, UK approaches, Asia Pacific approaches, and making sure that there's a consistent set of expectations, both for the governments, the industry, and for the public in understanding what to expect from this technology.
Thank you, George. I will also ask then Christina and Jessica to react to what you said. But first, I want to to ask Shilin from Swiss Re, also your perspective as a global reinsurance company, bringing expertise in risk assessment and management in the context of CCAM, as you said. So your interest in this field. So how is Swiss Re working with, for example, with the local and regional authorities to shape insurance policies that are adaptable to changing regulations while ensuring stability and reliability in risk assessment and management? So what's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different ways to tackle that question. I guess first, in terms of how, as insurers, we're keeping adaptable or keeping flexible. It's a good question, because traditional insurance is typically quite rigid. So insurance policies are typically structured by liability frameworks. So we have different policies for motor liability and different policies for product liability, and especially as a lot of these frameworks are in flux, as we've been talking about a bit today, like, is an AV a driver? Is it a product? If there's a person in the vehicle, to what extent can they be a driver? And George also mentioned this, navigating different jurisdictional requirements or different legislative requirements across different regions. At the end of the day, it makes for great discussion. It's a very interesting topic, but a difficult job, of course, for insurers. So one way to increase adaptability as these conversations are ongoing is creating new insurance products that aren't so dependent on liability distinction. So we've been working over the last few years on changes in wording, changes in contract language, and that can have a big impact on how flexible some of these policies can be. But in general, we think that AVs won't fall cleanly into one existing framework or another. As we talk about today, these new frameworks they're coming into place. For example, Jessica mentioned this user in charge concept. These new legal actors are coming into play as well. So it's likely that these new AV specific policies that we're developing, they're not just intermediary policies before we decide what existing types of insurance coverage best fits AVs. I think we'll continue to see more, not less, AV specific policies in the future. But that's very specifically on in the insurance side. You also, in your question, asked about how we work with policymakers in Europe and the UK. There's like a more traditional approach. We have representatives, for example, in this group called Insurance Europe, which is a European insurance and reinsurance federation, and that acts as kind of like the voice of the European insurance industry. So that's how we might work through some of the industry's interests or industry's concerns. Another thing that we've recently started exploring more is how, and this is another, so you touched upon this also a bit in your question, is how like risk assessment or risk management insights from the insurance industry that we've developed over the years can help inform the public and policymakers as well. So at Swiss Re in the advanced mobility team, which I'm a part of, we make decisions like day to day about what deployments feel safe, and we do that by looking at, for example, the safety practices, the technology, the locations that these companies are operating in. And over the years, we've developed our own set of toolkits for thinking about risk and safety and making decisions about what deployments are insurable and what deployments are not. So a question that we've been starting to explore, starting to think about is whether it's possible to link or collaborate with policy and regulation. So policy and regulation at the end of the day aims to protect the public and also aims to ensure safe deployments, which Christina and Jessica also talked about as well. So how can we link policy and regulation, which aims to protect the public, with the separate in-house decision-making that we've also honed over the years at Swiss Re, which in its own ways also aim to reduce risk to the public. So this is a step that we're just now starting to explore, and we're very excited to see where this goes. For example, we've started to focus some of our efforts on communicating some of our AV risk and safety insights and methods to the public, including with research with some of George's colleagues over at Waymo. And maybe we'll get a chance to talk about that later today.
Thank you, Shilin. Now I'm curious to hear from Maria Cristina and Jessica if you have any reaction from what both George and Celine said from their approach that are more, say, from the industry side. Do you have any reaction on that?
Well, from my side, I have to say that indeed we are very much committed to work towards harmonization, not only at European level across member states, but also at global level. So that's why we have been heavily involved in discussion and work ongoing at United Nations level. So this work will, the first phase of this work will end with the delivery of final guidance document by the working groups now working on safety requirements on one side and validation methods on the other. So by June, they are supposed to deliver this final document comprising guidance on those two aspects. And this would be a preliminary work that then should lead to a more consolidated regulation valid across all world regions, let's say. Then I think we will hear more on the next phase soon, hopefully. And again, we took inspiration from the work done at United Nations to develop our own EU regulation. So this will ensure that even once we will have a global instrument for regulating this kind of vehicles, still harmonization will be ensured easily also at European level, because we will be already aligned with those concepts and those methodologies. Indeed the question about alignment at member states level, indeed our regulation relates to the EU type approval. Still, there will be aspects that will be regulated and decided at local level because of the specificities of these use cases. So, for example, when you have shuttles, a shuttle will work on a specific path, and a specific path in a specific city will, of course, need also the involvement of local authorities. So this kind of approval cannot be done at European level and be valid for all cities and all selected paths, but will have to be done locally and specifically for each application. There will be other use cases where possibly this second step will be leaner and less time consuming, because most of the work will be done at the EU level with the EU type approval. But of course, we also look forward to improving this approach in the future. So I think as much as we gain knowledge about these new systems, we will be able also to progress on the scalability of the approaches and have a smoother and easier approach to indeed market introduction of new technologies.
Thank you, Maria Cristina. Jessica?
Yeah, I mean, it's always, I agree with Cristina so much. I don't think, I don't know, I would literally, yeah, basically everything she said, I completely agree. The importance of localism is something that we've also highlighted, not just, of course, at a European level, you're looking at national approaches, but even within the national approach, there is even the very local level, like Cristina was saying, of the path of particular vehicles. So it's something that we need to navigate for AVs. And I think figuring out how we best do that is very much part of the process of identifying the appropriate level of regulation. I think, yeah, so I think Cristina very well highlighted all that. I guess maybe reacting to some of the aspects that Celine talked about in respect of insurance. I think there's a lot that we can learn and work with, you know, the data and the risk management, which insurers are so adept at. It's something that bringing that knowledge and expertise as something that can guide us in doing better in-use monitoring can be a really valuable tool, because of course we just don't have the capacity to be enforcing actively against, you know, all these vehicles. We need really good reporting mechanisms and solid feedback loops, which I think insurers provide amazing feedback. And indeed, as part of the development of our regulations, insurers were a really valuable group, you know, in telling us what kind of data we need, and, you know, how realistic is it in terms of, you know, storage, and you know, because you expect our colleagues, you know, like George and others to be on the side of wanting to keep some of the data reporting requirements on the leaner side, rightly, there's a lot of proprietary information and aspects there, and it's really good to have that input, but alongside also, say, insurers and others, to be able to have a more complete view. So I think it's it's great to have this more concerted effort on that side.
Thank you, Jessica. I want to stay with you, and it's a topic that is particularly relevant for PAVE Europe. In UK, you are putting quite some attention in the societal benefits and public trust, which is quite interesting, but at the same time challenging from the regulatory perspective. So what is the approach to ensuring the safety of CCAM technology and gaining public trust, including the efforts to pilot AVs on public roads and engage with the local communities? As we know, it's not an easy task.
No, it isn't, but we have a lot of great help. So our social behavioral scientists play a really big part in helping us develop our policies. So for example, one of the key things that we see in terms of enabling trust is also making sure people understand what an automated vehicle is. There's a lot of confusion in public messaging, and for example, the difference with just driver assistance type systems, which are what we have on the road today, but the marketing can be quite bombastic, and that can create confusion. And indeed, if these systems get into trouble or don't perform as well as people might expect, that can harm the public trust in the whole endeavor of going towards automation. So I think we've got that very much in our top of our agenda, to make sure that there is better understanding of what is an AV, and getting the terminology to be a bit more consistent. So that's a joint effort. So we have been having various joint meetings with industry. Of course, Waymo has also been part of those conversations on AV Drive, and just getting those that kind of messaging to be appropriate. I think also just in terms of the trials and deployments, the department has been funding various different research projects. So one was like the Great Self-Driving Exploration that we conducted last year, in the summer of last year, and reported the requirements I think it was this summer that we came out in July. And it was basically looking to bring AVs to communities that might never have otherwise really engaged with them. For example, in the UK, we've got a lot of deployments in the Southeast and in the Midlands, but some other areas have a bit less exposure. So we were keen to see how people would react to AVs and what they wanted from AVs. And one of the really interesting parts that they did in that research was to use basically like helmets that would measure your brainwave activity, so that they could identify emotions of stress or reactions that you might not even be able to articulate with this EEG mechanism. And so there were, like, I think more than 1,000 people went through the trials. A much more limited group did the more full extent of the EEG, for example, but it gave some really interesting insights into the kinds of rides that were more exciting, or in other ways much less exciting, and sort of to notice where people were more trusting and what we could do to enhance that trust, the kind of information we might want to give people, and surveys, and trying to really also be led by the needs in the local community. So a lot of that research started off by asking people how they move today, not starting immediately to think about what a really distant future might look like, but what are your pain points today in your transport, and then bringing in AVs and giving them a much more concrete benchmark to see how they might help, maybe service routes that are have less frequent bus services, and how on demand might perhaps work better, and trying to really investigate that. So we've got that whole social behavioral side. There's also some really interesting projects in better understanding the needs of disabled persons with mass transit. So we have some research that is being commissioned on that side. Also looking, something I'm actually really interested in too, is the non-dynamic driving tasks of drivers. So that was a bit technical, the way I put it, but a lot of the development and conversations about self-driving, they focus on the system that can actually dynamically control the vehicle in traffic. And that's hugely important, of course. And all the ethical issues around it, the MIT moral machine, who do you run over if it's a binary choice? Like all those conversations have really had the limelight, but there's been a lot less attention about all those other things that drivers do that are not about moving the vehicle in traffic, but are still really important, like making sure that the vehicle is well maintained, that it has insurance, that the load is safe, all these things which are really practical and taken care of by drivers. We don't have little robot ADSs taking care of those. Like that hasn't been the focus of even the UN work, for example, that we've been sponsoring, and also the work that Christina's been doing at an EU level. And it's looking at how we can look at those non-dynamic driving tasks also for systems, and how we can make sure that they are looked at and shine more of a light on those. Certainly for people also that have mobility impairments, they might rely on a driver to help them on and off vehicles. So it's really important to think how that could work in practice, because that's actually one of the most exciting applications of this technology, is giving more freedom to move to people that don't have it. And so we need to look at also these non-dynamic elements to be able to make sure it's a reality and we don't stumble, at that last hurdle.
Thank you, Jessica. That's fascinating. George, do you have any comment on what Maria Cristina and Jessica said?
I mean, I think this is a great conversation so far. I mean, I think just picking up on Jessica's points that she just left off with, commercial service regulations become critically important in the process. These regulations that have applied to human drivers for decades are now applicable to autonomous vehicles. And what we found is that they actually fit quite well once the AV operator is the legal entity that's a responsible party. But it is a matter of regulatory interpretations, making it clear there's a distinction between authorizing the safety of the driving system for the driving task and then authorizing all of those other things. How you secure and maintain insurance, register the vehicle. If you're proceeding with heavy duty loads, how you're going through weigh stations. If you have a vehicle that's broken down in a lane of traffic, how you're warning other drivers. How you're hailing emergency services if a passenger has an issue inside of a vehicle. All of those practices exist today, whether it's for bus systems, rail systems, for taxi systems, for hire systems. But it's a matter of interpreting those to apply to AV use cases that's critically important. Otherwise, you could end up in a situation where you have your type approval, your system is safe in the eyes of both the industry and the government, but if there's no use case to really complete the circle, there's no real path to operation with members of the public. I also want to pick up on Jessica's point about public trust. And I think public trust is built up at several levels in industries like this. And I think because the industry is still nascent, we don't really see as much work happening globally on this. One pillar of public trust is public trust based on government outcomes. Many of these regulations that we're talking about here, legislative frameworks, really are not widely known. Usually when I'm in conversations like this, I'm the only person in the room who even knows these regulations exist for the safety of these systems. And the top question I get asked in my personal life is, when are these things going to be regulated? And so when that does happen, when you have some of these world-changing frameworks released, like the EU's framework, communicating that widely is critically important. And I think there has been a severe lack of funding for government educational campaigns. That's a global issue in the AV space. And I think it's largely been because the number of AVs have been quite small. But as the numbers scale up and as companies commercialize, as Waymo has, that kind of government funding for public education will have to be critical to actually meet the need. The second piece is company education. And while companies can educate about the safety of their tech, there's really no replacement for people in the cars. We are now serving tens of thousands of rides per week. Our service territory in Phoenix has grown to more than 600 square kilometers. We're talking about substantial numbers of people that are really documenting their own experiences, posting videos, telling their friends, telling their family members, going through their first ride to understand that this is a safe and predictable driver. But there's really, truly no replacement for that. And I would draw your attention to the experience that you might have first had when you took a ride in an airplane for the first time. It's extremely exciting, but so many of the experiences since then were completely not memorable. Because once those safety expectations are set, the regulatory process are set, and there's a public expectation that this is something I can use in my everyday life, really the mystique goes away, and this just becomes a part of the regular patchwork of everyday life. The problem is AVs aren't in most of the world. That's why questions from the public continue to arise and research is needed. But more than that, I think this joint public-private partnership of educating the public once the AVs do show up is going to be critical for actually addressing the people who may still be worried, despite all of those factors. But thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you, George. And I mean, we see what is happening in US and then San Francisco and in other cities where Waymo is also deploying many vehicles there. Is there anything that you would recommend as lesson learned to European legislators from that perspective?
Yeah, these are great questions. I would say that the early communication that I just left off with was a key missing piece. The regulations, for example, in California were completed in 2018, but there are quite a few things that happened in the last few years that it really, I think, didn't go quite as noticed. Responder practices for first responders like police, fire, emergency vehicles started being put together by US states and companies releasing their first plans for guiding how work would happen if there's a collision, a vehicle needs to be retrieved, if a passenger has an emergency, if a vehicle ends up in a collision where people have to be extricated with the jaws of life, these really severe injury-causing events. And I think things like that, that kind of orchestration of best practices really hasn't gotten much attention. I also think another practice is alignment of government work with companies at different levels of government vertically. In the US, we have a federal system, a state system, and a city system. And the states in which Waymo operates today have their own state regional laws. There are no local laws on AVs functioning in these states. And while you might assume alignment between all three levels of government and the work that they do, often, as we all know, politics don't necessarily lead to that kind of outcome. And depending on who's in power at what time, there can be substantial differences of opinion in terms of whether a law that was passed is right or wrong, whether the measures taken or the opinions made were the right or the wrong ones. And I think in that respect, when it comes to the government education of the public, the documentation of what's out there, what is approved, what is not, becomes critical. Because oftentimes many of the systems that we get asked about aren't systems that have gone through any of these approvals. They're not ALKS, they're not level 4 systems. They're not ones that are being debated at the UN ECE level. Oftentimes the questions are tied to what Celine mentioned earlier, things like driver assistance systems. And that's where, again, educating the public on what is on the road, what's not on the road, what's impacting the public, what's not, and what has actually earned any kind of measure of government trust versus what hasn't, starts to become critical. And that's something that I spend a good chunk of my time doing in my daily work, but it needs to be a broader effort through groups like PAVE Europe and abroad.
Thank you, George. Thank you. Talking about safety, and Christina mentioned, and also Jessica, how safe is enough? Safe is enough. That's the question and the main challenge. And Celine, Swiss Re and Waymo recently published a study using Waymo data, by the way, showing how driverless vehicles crash less often and damage less property than human-driven vehicles. So it seems to be an important study, an important result that maybe deserve a virtual panel itself that we maybe will do in the future. But if you can highlight a bit the outcomes of this study and also may connect to regulation at some point. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so as Guido just mentioned, we conducted research with some of Waymo's George's colleagues over at Waymo to briefly summarize what that looks like. We looked at liability claims data. So we compared Waymo's liability claims data with a human baseline that we produced over at Swiss Re that was matched to the geographical locations of San Francisco and Phoenix, which is in Arizona. And we found with this comparison that the Waymo One service significantly reduced the number of property damage claims and bodily injury claims across all different types of deployment. And The research was interesting for several reasons. It helps to answer, for one, this big question on a lot of people's minds, which is whether these vehicles are safer than humans. And in terms of asking these questions, like how safe is safe enough, for many people, that often tends to be like one criteria: is it safer than a human driver? To be able to answer that question, we've asked this question for many years. We first need to know how safe human drivers are, which turned out to not be a very trivial question. So that was one also major contribution of this work, which was establishing a human baseline for comparison using insurance data. And I know we might be running low on time, so going into the sort of policy and the regulatory standpoint of this, I'm not sure how much time we have for that, but for us it was an interesting practice, or interesting first step in terms of how we can communicate research and safety insights to the general public, and see what the public and the regulators can perhaps learn from that, from both the insights and the methods themselves.
Thank you, Shelin. We will come back to this soon. Thanks a lot. Maria Cristina, any reaction to what George and Shelin said? Yeah. Do you have anything to add to that?
Well, thank you, Vida. I think all those that were mentioned are very relevant aspects, and they're also discussed in our working groups at both EU and UNEC level. For example, what also Jessica mentioned about usability and accessibility from impaired users. So we made a proposal so that there might be requirements, so safety requirements for that, for automated driving systems of all level, considered and discussed also at United Nations. And concerning indeed how safe is safe enough, this is a very good question. So we also had discussion around the metrics that could be used technically. So what makes sense technically might be difficult to be communicated to the public. And so we are discussing about which kind of effective risk communication can be used to also involve the public and ensure that indeed there is trust around the use of automated driving vehicles. Because indeed, I think also, as George mentioned, parallel with the aviation sector, railway sector is quite easy and comes naturally to our minds. So when you board a plane, you don't ask yourself, how safe is this vehicle? How safe? Well, am I going to crash and die today? Fine. So now you just probably just set up and read your magazine or sleep even. So that's what we should aim also for driving automation. And from, of course, our perspective, one way to reach that situation is through regulation. So we know that, for example, in the US, they have quite a different approach. They do not have type approval, but rather self-certification. So George mentioned that indeed some states are drafting their own regulations, but still they have a different approach, not to verifying too much with the testing or questions before the market introduction. So in this sense, we see that regulation does not constitute a barrier to deployment, but rather it constitutes an enabler, because this will also increase public trust and will allow the introduction of new technologies. In this sense, the public says, so someone checked the vehicles and it is safe enough to access public roads. So I think it's already good reason enough to try. And then we also introduced this in-service monitoring reporting concept. So we proposed it the first time in the United Nations discussion, and then since it was developed there with the contribution of many experts, we also imported back it to the European regulation. And we see this as a tool, best practice tool for safety management that will allow us also to improve the safety during the lifetime of the vehicles. So we are really implementing new innovative methodologies to make sure that indeed not only we assess and the vehicles are safe enough, but they will start indeed developing and improving throughout their lifetime for what concerns safety.
Thank you, Maria Cristina and Jessica. Well, any reaction about what the other panelists said? And then I have a question from an interesting one from the audience. What was the most difficult autonomous law you had to write, and why?
Yeah, so let's say, I guess in reaction to some of the aspects raised. I mean, I think proving the safety and the benchmark against which we're going to be measuring AVs is definitely a really tough question. We just had a select committee looking at this issue here in the UK and looking at our safety ambition and how we measure how safe is safe enough. And it was generally very complimentary, you know, around what government had done, but they really were quite critical in respect of the safety ambition that we'd suggested, which was comparing the safety of a careful and competent driver, saying that it was not far-reaching enough, you know, we should be asking for more, and it was too vague, for example. So of course, setting the threshold is entirely different, you know, all the work that Christina has been talking about and that we've been working on too, which is breaking it up into steps, you know, looking at the safety case and then looking at, you know, vehicle testing and how it performs in scenarios and all those aspects. But from a public perception and from a political discussion point of view, setting this threshold is actually a really challenging aspect, you know, to get buy-in and to get people to really embrace what we're doing. And I think bridging that gap between the public discourse about how safe is safe enough versus the technical standards and the metrics, you know, that also Christina was highlighting that don't necessarily talk to the public. Like in meetings, I always hear, oh, we're going to be complying to ISO 26262. That's like one of the, you know, key aspects that you hear, you know, in respect of safety. And it's not even a publicly available specification, you know, and it's just really interesting how there's just a lack of nexus between what can make sense to an individual, you know, that might be encountering this technology in the real world versus what we are better able to do on a technical front. So I think bringing those together is a huge challenge for us all. We need to work together, I think, to really tackle that issue. And in terms of the hardest laws that, I mean, I don't actually write them because in our division of work, we have specialized counsel that draft, but even just coming up with a policy, the one that was most controversial that we worked on, I think, as part of the automated vehicles review was passenger service and licensing. We had initially recommended moving to a national scheme of licensing for self-driving vehicles. So currently it's a very local scheme. Each local authority has the ability to basically give its own taxi or private hire license or for buses, right? And we were suggesting that now that we have AVs, we might move to a system that was actually more national based, you know, with uniform standards. And we got incredible pushback on that. And it's the only aspect that we completely had to retract on. Everything else, broadly, we were able to tweak and adjust. That one, we actually had to completely remold and revise. So we moved away from national passenger services licensing for AVs and moved instead to like harmonizing and bringing national coherence to oversight of vehicles that don't have a user in charge in them, which was therefore leaving out the passenger carrying element. So I think, yeah, there's definitely a lot of aspects there. And it was again about a really strong feeling that many had of the importance of local decision-making and standards. And bridging that is definitely something that we need to really work through as a community as well.
Thank you, Jessica. George, we have here Jessica from the UK. We have Maria Cristina from the European Commission, European Union. That's some closing statement or reactions from your side?
I think it's been an excellent discussion. I think it's exactly the kind of discussions we need to keep having. This sector reached a bit of a trough of disillusionment, I think, in the press a few years ago, that this was never happening, the technology's never coming, it's not real, it's vaporware. And I think as you're seeing from this esteemed panel, it's not only real, the governments are taking it very seriously. And I think that's extremely important. For technology that's going to be sharing the roads with human drivers for years to come, but a process that needs to begin now. So I just want to thank the other panelists for all their contributions and all their time here.
Thank you, George. And Shilin, last question for you as well. What are the biggest barriers that Swiss Re currently faces in being able to effectively and accurately estimate the price, the risk of AV deployment? So it's quite a challenging question.
Yeah, I mean, we have like lots of challenges. We have a whole team, I guess, then that's the team I'm part of, dedicated to navigating some of those challenges. I mean, one of the biggest ones is we don't have much historical data that we're working with right now. Um, for one, that's because the cars haven't been on the roads for that long, and two, they're not crashing that much. So we don't have a lot of incident data to work with. So a lot of what we're doing right now is developing new ways of how to assess risk, because traditional insurance is typically based off of historical data. So we're looking at new ways of developing risk models. We do that in partnership with different research groups. For example, we work with Stanford and Harvard and also ETH Zurich in developing some more like forward-looking risk assessment models, and we also develop ways to assess risks based off of some like characteristics about the company, and a big part of our risk assessment also is really looking at the location that the car is driving in. So like, what's the worst case scenarios that can happen in this road, and what's pedestrian traffic look like over there? So we're coming at this from a lot of different angles to accommodate the fact that we really don't have that much historical data that we're working with. I'd say that would be our primary challenge. And it's a very exciting one for sure that we're working with, and ends up with a lot of interesting technical discussions that I'm very excited to be a part of. And I'm very also excited to share ultimately more about this in the coming months and years.
Yeah, for sure. You will, we will get in touch for that. And now the tough job to Kim to summarize the discussion
extremely quickly. This really
And,
fascinating discussion as well. Thanks, Guido, and thank you to all the panelists for really like a fantastic conversation. The key takeaways I think that I've seen in this conversation are really the need for innovative approaches to regulation. This is very novel technology. It's nothing we've dealt with before. It's a very novel type of social risk, and so there's going to need to be those very unique types of partnerships between the public sector policymakers, the private sector, and researchers, especially as we try to, the regulation doesn't stop when it's published. It's the regulation of the vehicles and the services is going to continue after deployment. And then, so also then something between the hyper-technical and the hyper-local issues. So this is a hyper-technical technology that we're trying to regulate and make understandable for the public to know it's safe. And that also links to the question of, this is a very multinational discussion. There's discussions going on at the UN level. There's questions about harmonization across jurisdictions. But ultimately, this is a technology that ends up being deployed hyper-locally. And, you know, ordinary people who aren't connected into those discussions at the multilateral level, they they still have very strong feelings about how this technology gets deployed. And that brings us into the ongoing desperate need for public education about this technology, and how safe is safe enough. Are we letting perfect getting in the way of the desire for perfect getting in the way of the good? But also we need to be look to best practices, such as what we've seen in aviation. And then the question of the metrics of safety are very different to the feeling of safety for the public. We can make metrics for safety, but does that mean that anyone in the public, does it mean your grandmother is going to believe that it's safe? And the final takeaway that I'll get is, when do we get to the point of AVs being boring? And I was lucky enough to have actually was in a Waymo when I was recently in San Francisco. I was absolutely delighted. I obviously spammed every single person in my WhatsApp contact list, but after a few minutes it became very boring. Well, not boring, it's still very exciting for those reasons. So how do we make the very exciting, the very challenging, the very transformative become very boring, so that we fall asleep as we do on the plane, as Christina said? So I hope I managed to summarize everything as best I can, but thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you, Guido, for fantastic moderation as well.
Thank you.
And shout out to the next in the series on regulatory sandboxing, innovative approaches that Remo will be hosting in the coming month with PAVE.
Thanks a lot, Kim. That was brilliant and excellent. So now time is up. Thank you very much, Jessica, George, Maria Cristina, Shilin, Kim, for joining our very interesting conversation today. I think I found it very, very enlightening, and I hope that also the audience that we had today found it very interesting. The recording will be available in the PAVE Europe website There will be also a PAVE cast, so you can listen it while you are in the plane or while you are in a self-driving vehicle, who knows, at some point. Thank you all for joining us today and looking forward to see you next time. Bye.